Welcome back to the Iron Sights podcast. I have John Valentine coming to us. We're going to be talking combatives today, and we're going to demystify that a little bit for me, and hopefully that helps other people because I find the whole world very interesting, but also a little mysterious, and I think it's that way for a lot of reasons. I love how you explain stuff. I'm hoping you can explain all the stuff that I have, all the questions I have for you today. John, welcome to the show, my dude.
Scott, man, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I mean, I'm a fan of Iron Sights podcast, so to be here as a guest is pretty incredible. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, I'm honored to have you. And just real quick for the audience in terms of this connection, you popped up on my radar only a few months ago. Well, when I say a few months, probably in the last 6 months. I was interested in some of the engagement I saw you having with some of the other folks, let's say in the combative space, but also sort of in the firearms world, the things that we kind of cover on the show. You and I had gone back and forth just a couple of times, just sort of on Instagram on the back end through DMs and stuff. I'm like, this guy, I like this guy's take. And I also like that he seems to have some inroads and some practical hands-on experience with people that are maybe a little less known in the combative space. And I've had a couple of people on, but I'll be honest, one of the reasons I haven't really explored it super deeply and had more people on is that my understanding of it is limited. And I've just been kind of on my own journey outside of the podcast, trying to understand kind of the characters, where some of this stuff comes from, where it's going on my own, and then was hoping to kind of bring it back. And honestly, I didn't expect to find, I guess, like the roots and the fingers go way off into different directions. And so when you get into that, it's like, man, this can be a little overwhelming. It's also super interesting, and I haven't shared a lot of that. So again, circling back with you, making this connection is super important for me, and I'm stoked. And there's a lot of things for us to talk about today, so let's get into it. But before, the real question here that I have right off the bat is this name Johnny Valentine. Like, is this shit for real, man? Like, how's that worked out for you in life? Because I feel like if my name was Johnny Valentine, I'd be a lot further in life somehow. I don't know, man. What can you tell me about this?
Oh man, yeah, man. If I had the confidence that my homies have in me, I'd probably go a lot further.
It's like some Wyatt Earp shit or something. It's a cool name.
That's my real name. So.
That's great. Well, let's find out about you, man. This is how I usually start these things with folks, especially like sometimes I come in with a lot of intel on people, and sometimes I come in with very little on you. So this is going to be a learning experience for me and the audience. So tell us about yourself, man. You can start wherever and finish wherever. Just got to be patient with me. May stop you, cut you off to get some clarification and ask some follow-up questions. Ready, set, go.
All right. So for me and how I ended up in this industry as a instructor, for lack of a better word, is mostly just as a journey to scratch my own itch. I started like the first kind of instructor program that I ever went through was the Army Combatives Training. And, immediately there, getting certified as instructor, somebody who is like the subject matter expert. I knew I wasn't an expert. Like I had 40 hours of training and immediately like the student base there was like the personal security detail for my brigade commander, brigade sergeant major, who are like epic badasses. So I was like, okay, I've got to get serious about this. So first thing I did was buy every book I can buy and get really engaged in the process of training. I didn't understand that's what I was doing at the time, but I was organically just focused on a process center training as opposed to an outcome. And that's really where I came. And then from there, I continued to do jiu-jitsu, started competing a little bit, fought MMA and boxing overseas. And then later on, I ended up getting concealed carry permit. I was a purple belt in jiu-jitsu at the time, and then I didn't do anything cool in the Army, but I remember watching on video like this guy getting, like 5 or 6 grenades like getting launched at him, and it took like 6 grenades to like kill this dude. So I knew bullets, you know what I mean? Like I knew bullets didn't make people disappear by any chance. So I remember asking the instructor when I was getting my concealed carry permit, I was like, hey, so what happens? Like, how does that work if I get into a fight with somebody while I'm armed? Because like the class you just told me says like if somebody just swings on me, that's not justifiable as far as lethal force goes. And then he was like, well, you just shoot them. And I wasn't satisfied with that answer.
Awesome answer.
So it just And then from there, like Hurricane Sandy hit as well while I was living
Mm.
in New York City. So I understood like the civil unrest. It wasn't like the first time like I've been in like a kind of a breakdown, a temporary breakdown of society while living in a big city. And so I ended up joining like a national readiness network that was run by a friend named Jay Paisley, and he was a retired Green Beret. And I asked him, I was like, "Hey Jay, like, what do you know about like concealed carry combatives?" And he was like, "Look, I can fight, but like I don't have the credentials." And he said that I was more credentialed than him as far as teaching that.
Okay.
I didn't believe him, so I so I continued to search for people, and the only person that could come to mind was Matt Larson, who created the Army Combatives program. And I'm like, well, I'm living in Virginia at the time. I was like, well, let me do a Google search. Let me see if I could find him, at least, connect with him on social media. And, just the way God works, opening doors for me. Matt just happened to have a jujitsu gym like 10 minutes from my house where I was living. So I immediately go meet him. And as I show up, he was actually actively looking for someone to work for him as an instructor. And he was like, "Look, man, come work for me. We'll do this contract. Well, I'll teach you all the tactical stuff. And then you figure out as far as your program and how do you want to put a program together and everything like that." And I came to Matt as a purple belt, got my brown belt from him, got my black belt from him. Spent about 2 or 3 years working as a contract with teaching kind of some of the warfighters within the greater Washington area. End up meeting Craig Douglas, Cliff Byerly, and just kind of like everything just snowballed into one thing or another. Ended up becoming an assistant instructor for Green Ops, working with starting strength, and like just I got into this really as to scratch my own itch, just figure out how to do this how to fight while having a concealed firearm, and it just took me in places that I would have never expected. And I'm really like, and I did that like I really underestimated what I was able to accomplish over the last 10 years. And so I'm really excited as far as what's to happen next. And now we have our second Combative Summit where we just gather pretty much the guys who've been uh, have the greatest bodies of work in terms of combatives all co-located in one place. We had our first one last year. And so, yeah, and I just, you know, this is a happy accident for me is really the long and short of it. So.
I love that, actually, that happy accident. I kind of feel like that about where sort of how I landed in this whole podcast thing. It's just there's a sort of moon, sun, and stars lined up, and I really didn't know where it was going, and then it just kind of snowballed. And I feel really fortunate because it's put me in front of so many cool people in so many different situations, and obviously, like here today with you, to talk to a guy who's super passionate about the things that he does on a daily basis. And those are the folks that I find have the most to offer. The ones that kind of just landed us and they're doing this because they just feel drawn to it. There's like a calling to it somehow, and also a little bit of luck has happened with them along the way. Maybe some misfortune at the same time that's really opened their eyes to the realities that exist. In the combative space, that could be relative to a particular situation, obviously violence or training or whatever it happens to be. But I just mean just kind of in the world and the people that they come across and the circles that they run with. And so you just covered a lot right there, and you dropped quite a few names, and I think we should go back and revisit some of those here, because those are that cast of characters. Or some of those folks are people that I have looked into and kind of been trying to kind of loosely but also closely in some sense follow and kind of figure out. And we'll come back to that, but let's go way back. So you mentioned a military career, you mentioned the Army. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean,
Yeah, sure.
where'd you grow up, and then how did that happen for you? Were you a 9/11 guy, or were you pre 9/11? You're a young dude. I mean, you look young, but maybe that just comes with the territory. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I joined the Army in 2003.
Okay.
So yeah, I grew up in New York City. Born and raised in the Bronx, and I was 16 years old when 9/11 happened.
Wow.
And then yeah, so I joined in the Army as part of what's called a delayed entry program.
Mm-hmm.
So at 17, as soon as I could join, I joined. I was a signal soldier, so I just did like austere communication. So I joke around. I would refer to it as like tactical Verizon. Like you put me anywhere, and we'd have fiber optic network, satellite communications, secure, unsecure, all that stuff like set up like within
right now.
Our record was like 45 minutes having, data
Wow.
transmit. So, and yeah, I mean, things, I ended up, my first deployment was to Afghanistan. Spent a year there as a FOB Salerno. And so I didn't expect anything like, I didn't expect to do like, okay, I'm going to be out here kicking doors. I expected like, yeah, I'm going to be here doing my comm thing,
Mhm.
providing force protection, doing what I needed to do.
Mhm.
And just the experience there, I mean, I gained a whole lot more. Like the Army gave me so much more than I gave it, honestly. I see guys that talk about like the experiences kind of broke them up and everything like that. Like I joined the Army specifically to really, I grew up bullied and abused and everything like that. My dad was alienated. So I kind of came with all everything that comes with the territory with that. I grew up with that. And
Mhm.
I wanted to overcome that. Like I really wanted to destroy the version of myself that I really hated. And just what I viewed at myself at the time as a young 18-year-old was like, yeah, I was incapable. I wasn't as strong as I wanted to be. I wasn't able to shoot the way I wanted to shoot. I wasn't able to fight the way I wanted to fight. And those things bothered me. They irked me. And the Army definitely put me on the path 100% to overcoming that and seeking those things. And now at least I feel as if I can be a credible source for people at a minimum, at least starting them off. And so that's kind of where I was trying to become, is just really authentically capable in those areas, and also in a way where like it's objective. I don't have to like talk about myself. I don't have to be like, oh well, let me tell
Mm.
you how cool I am. Like,
Mhm.
I've never been that type of person. It was just it was really more about self esteem, and then serving others. That's really my life story.
I love that. How long were you in?
I was in the Army 9 years.
Okay.
I got out in 2012 and 6 year break in service. Then ended up joining the Air Force in 2018, and I'm still active.
Okay, so hang tight. So let's go back real quick to the combatives piece, because you said you got introduced to that in the Army, and I was this introduced to you just sort of in the basic training phases, and then you explored it from there, or was there something else there? What can you tell us about that? 'Cause that's a
All right,
missing
so
piece for me.
that's funny story, right? Like so,
Good, I love funny
um,
stories.
I laugh because I hear my friend Matt's voice. You know what I mean? Like I remember him saying, like, I can tell who were the guys who didn't grow up with a man in the house because they were like hyper masculine and kind of insecure. Yeah, like ask me how I know that's true, right? So, anyway, so long story short, I get into a fight at basic training, and I'm the first one to do it. And anyway, so I kind of developed some infamy for that. And
Okay.
so when Combatives Day came, I had this drill sergeant Butler. I'll never forget this guy. And he's like, where's Rocky at? Where's Slugger? He's like, you come out here, right? like, so like we had done like a day of the
You want to
training.
fight? Let's fight.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Here's
Yes,
your chance. Yeah.
I didn't know anything, right? And he pairs me up with this dude who's like, this dude was yoked, right? Like he was maybe, I don't know, 10% body fat. And I'm like 160 maybe. And this dude is like really wearing me out, man. And like, I'm just using my position, holding him. I kind of just use that like old school Gracie style with the guy. I just basically held him, let him get tired, and then got on top, and then I landed an arm bar.
Okay.
And I grew up boxing as a kid and doing like traditional martial arts. That was the first time I ever done grappling. I grew up in the '90s, guys, so I come from a different time. So
Hmm.
I don't mean to be offensive. It's just what it was. Like we just viewed grappling as like that shit is gay. Like we're not
Hmm.
doing that. Like we're not wrestling. We're gonna throw hands, right? So that's the hood view of grappling. So that's what I did. And when I got to basic, getting introduced to grappling, and then from there, landing an armbar in front of everyone, it was like a rush, man. So I was like, that shit, and it was like, oh, this is real. This actually works. And I was like, I don't know what that was, but yeah, combatives. I want to do that.
Okay.
And then fast forward, I'm like training with a bunch of people that are like because this is, early 2000s. Today we can throw a rock and hit a jiu-jitsu black belt.
Yeah, didn't even
Right?
have to do that.
But
Yeah.
back then, it's like if a dude showed up with a blue belt, it's like, whoa, who is that dude?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, exactly.
So,
And what's a blue belt? Yeah.
right.
Right.
So so I was just training with just like random groups of dudes that were just getting together. We were buying videotapes and just like, rolling,
Hmm.
deployed to Afghanistan. And like my platoon sergeant gave me like a DVD set. And it wasn't until I went to Iraq in '07 where I formally went through this combatives program. And my instructor is a friend of mine named Andrew Heyman, right? He's retired now. So, it's a big shout out to him. And I went through the level 1, and there was this guy there. His name was De Souza, and I thought he was Puerto Rican because I'm Puerto Rican. So, and he had a thick accent, but come to find out he was Brazilian, and he was a blue belt, and I was like, oh man, that's awesome. I didn't know what a blue belt was. I just know he beat my ass for like the whole 15-month deployment. So I was like, man. So he's like, oh man, no, what you're doing is jujitsu. It's jujitsu. I'm like, jujitsu. What's the hujitsu? What is that?
Right.
So so I went on that. Pride fighting championships there. And one of my favorite fighters was Ryan Gracie, because he was just, he was just a thug, man. And he was
A
gangster.
thug.
He was good looking. He was aggressive. And I was like, that's me. I like that dude.
Dude's a savage.
Yeah. And I find out his brother Henzo has an academy in New York City.
Yep.
So when I go on my leave for my R&R, that's the first place I went. And it was awesome. Then afterwards, I came back in 2008. They had a trip to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil.
Okay.
Went with them there, spent a week there. I'm like a brand new white belt. I'm just
you're
like
getting
a
the
young
full immersive experience
Oh,
here, man.
dude, I was a true believer, right? So I just committed 100%. Went there. Once I got back, Greg Thompson, who is the creator of the SOCP program, he has his gym called Team Rock. Joined them, was training there for a little bit. Then en route to move to the Netherlands, I go back to New York, get my blue belt there in the Henzo Gracie Academy, then move on to Holland, train there, get a purple belt there, come back, train a little bit again with the Henzo Gracie Academy in the Bronx, and then end up going to Matt in Virginia. And
Got it.
Yeah, rest is history.
Got it. Okay, so that pulls the pieces to me or together for me in a lot of ways. Okay, and this also your experience through the jiu-jitsu world also I think tells a story, which if for people that haven't heard of you until now or will listen to you going forward, I think they'll understand you better having known that story. And the way I think you approach things. It's interesting the timing that you got into it, because I remember that big time as well. That was a different time. Things were evolving so very fast. UFC was doing its thing. There were a couple of other things going on. Like you mentioned Pride. People were trying to pull this whole thing together. Like, what is going on out there? Where do these guys train? Who are they training with? What are their backgrounds? And at the time, it wasn't, while it was mixed martial arts, it wasn't really in competition yet. It was, people were trying to put it together. And what I meant by that is everybody had a specialty, so to speak. Like it was like you were a jiu-jitsu guy, you were a Muay Thai guy, you were a pancrase guy, something like that. And then you were like trying to like bolt on these other pieces from these other martial arts or other types of methodologies, if you will. And you were seeing that evolve in the ring or on the mats and the octagons and things like that. As we were watching, it was super fascinating, but it was evolving incredibly fast. And the reality of it was the guys that were really making a name for themselves were generally the BJJ guys, because as soon as they got their hands on you, you were in big trouble, right? So if they could just keep you at bay for a while and you didn't get knocked out, it typically went to the ground, and then you kind of saw like there was not a lot of, I'll just say this, I don't remember in a lot of cases seeing a lot of competition there. Whoever had the BJJ black belt was going to clean up once it hit the mat. And you could just see it happening. Whether you understood the sport of BJJ or that everything about it or not, you're just like, oh, this dude's going to get handled. Like, don't put that arm there. I don't know why you don't put your arm there. I just know don't put your arm there because you're going to wind up in trouble, or don't put your leg there because you're going to wind up in trouble. Again, going back to the evolution of it, having you be like immersed in that with those dudes who were at the front of all of this at the time, I think again probably, for me, puts a lot of pieces together.
MMA was to martial arts what CrossFit was to the
Yeah.
fitness.
Yeah, good way. Yeah, good
Right?
way of looking at it.
It
Yep.
was just like, it was like, no, like you actually can do all the things and you can be good at them.
Mhm.
And what happens is that you actually have to choose a focus. And what we saw was that if people have a particular base, uh, this one being grappling, they tend to do better than the people who don't. And like we see that now with most of the champions in the UFC happen to be wrestlers.
Which is different than BJJ. So
Correct.
I don't. Maybe we can talk about that later.
Right. So we saw a lot of things happening. We saw the evolution of martial arts, right? Or excuse me, we saw in real time. We didn't know what we were watching, right? Like we understand it now because we've got hindsight. But what we saw was a natural evolution of martial arts, and we saw what martial arts, what they actually are, and it's really a tactic on how to approach a fight. So, for instance, most people in general, most people you fight in the world before that time, their strategy was the same: was bludgeon this person with their fists until they can no longer fight back effectively,
Mhm.
right? And if what's the world class boxer's plan? Same plan. What's the Taekwondo guy's plan? Same plan. They were just better at executing the plan. So they had that plan. What they did was this martial art, or this process of repetition and refinement. That's what that became. And then jujitsu is they're like, okay, well, if somebody has this strategy or this tactic, my tactic's going to be grab them, put them down, and immobilize them because they can't generate force, right? And then wrestlers, then we saw wrestling, right? Chuck Liddell comes
Right.
and he uses his wrestling in reverse, where he used it as a means to keep the fight from going to the ground.
Mhm.
And then we had the sprawl and brawl evolution. So we had tactics coming out of that stuff. And we saw that people, the specialists, yeah, I mean, it didn't matter what you specialized in, even with jujitsu. Like if you specialize in one thing, um, you're not going to do well. I mean,
Right.
it took a while for jujitsu for that to catch up with jujitsu, but it finally has, I think. It's definitely jujitsu's had their time in the sun for sure.
Yep. Mhm.
But now that the cat's out the bag, so to speak, people understand like what to do, how to avoid, what's a dangerous position, what's a takedown, how to avoid a takedown, and you know what I mean. So that's really what we saw. So we had a lot of revolution over the last 20 years with training in general.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I think that's kind of what leaves it a little bit misunderstood too, because if you don't understand the history of it, where it was then to where it is now, and again, I'm just sort of an infant in all of this. Just when I look at the bigger picture and how fast it evolves, and has evolved, and it's evolving still, because then if we start adding, the weapons component into it, which we can talk about in a little bit here, it even changes it even a ton more. So. Um, You mentioned okay. So going back, so you mentioned there was a 6-year break before going into the Air Force. So from Army to Air Force, what was going on during that time? Training all the
So
time?
so
What was going on?
Yeah. So at that time, that's when I got into the training industry. Or I went to college, and then I was just mainly doing training. For the most part, I was either taking college classes or staying with the kids and training. That's kind of the main thing. And
Okay.
I was kind of figuring out how to do this. And working for Matt, we ended up doing a lot of stuff. Like we ended up traveling kind of across the East Coast, running some courses at his place, and we were just kind of figuring out like how to get into this business. And the other side of that too was, people needed something that wasn't my bias. That's the way I looked at that. Like the customer deserves something that's not my bias. So I wanted to solve the problem that the client had. I didn't want them to like do what I liked,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So it put me on training further, right? Really, and more specializing as far as the intersection of all these things. I put a heavy emphasis on jujitsu because it's just like it was my base, right? Like I look at that as my base, and then from there, also organically develop stuff with fitness. And now I'm picking up the firearms piece, or really like diving into the specialty side of performance shooting. And but then I learned that there's all these people that have been doing this for like years that I've never even heard of.
Right.
I met in 2020, I met Craig Douglas, Jerry Wetzel, Cliff Byerly, um, just like guys that are like, whoa, like, yeah, man, I've been doing this since the 90s, had a road show and like, shooting each other with Sims and all this. I'm like,
Okay, so let's time out on that for a second, because I think that has a lot to do with this mystery. Because I think people looking at that, if you mentioned like Craig going back 20 years, and I haven't met Craig yet. I hope to do that someday. I think I found him to be a really interesting guy. But my point of that is like, that's like weird, man. Like, you're a weirdo. Like, what are you doing here? Like, knives, guns, grappling, punching people in the face, all of this. This seems a little extreme, right? Just
right.
and I say that obviously tongue in cheek, but like, I get where it's kind of been underground, because people looking at that from the outside that, number one, don't understand it. Right, they don't understand it. Would look at that as like, dude, that looks a little weird, man. And you talk to Craig and you talk to these guys who understand. And I haven't talked to Craig, like I said, but what I get, I think, is if you talk to guys like this and you listen to them, they understand that people think that they're weird. Because they're misunderstood. So they're a little bit more quiet about it, and they're very cautious in kind of how they try to explain things or what they explain. And again, I think this goes back to the mystery of of how this information has gotten out there and where it is now, particularly in the, we start to look at, kind of how social media and things play into this. But I think that's a big piece of this. So like, you got introduced having being totally immersed in this to these guys that have been doing it for a very long time, and you'd never even heard of them before. Can you talk just a little bit about those initial interactions and kind of what you were picking up? Yeah, can you talk about that?
Oh man, I mean, it was just, I mean, it was the first time we met, I felt like we've known each other for years, because it was like, it's funny because I know a lot of black belts in martial arts, and what I will say about that is that they don't really understand the martial arts or think about the martial arts the way I do, in sense of like, this is part of what I do. It's not necessarily like my identity.
Mm,
It's not something like I identify as. It's just like, hey, this is something I've done and something I use to solve the problem in front of me. And sometimes it may not be the appropriate thing. And what I see with a lot of martial artists is like, they really want to push what they like. And this is what
mm,
I mean by clients deserve more than my bias in that sense. And what I noticed in talking to Craig, talking to Cliff, talking to people like Fletch Fuller, Matt Larson, is like, they weren't necessarily doing martial arts; they were using them.
mm,
That's a very, very different thing.
mm,
Um, and so when we met, it was a great conversation. Like, we spent hours just like kind of just deliberating over material approaches, semantics,
mm,
because instructorship is its own skill as well. And I think that's something people really undervalue in a lot of ways, in terms of that they do not develop themselves as far as how they deliver material.
mhm.
Because as far as putting the picture in your mind of what's inside my mind, that's
It's a
that
skill.
takes some deliberate, yeah, that
Mhm,
takes some deliberate effort, in terms of like, I'm going to make sure that there's no filler words. There's not going to be ums or ers. I'm going to use precise language. I'm going to do it with brevity and cogency. Everything's going to be congruent, so everything fits together. That's not something a lot of people focus on. And like, just watching Craig teach took my teaching to the next level.
So here's an interesting part of this. When I think of, you mentioned Matt Larson several times, and listening to kind of him talk, or listening to Craig, or a whole list of guys there. There's a part of this that I think is um, it's a little tough for people to discern, particularly dudes, males, as they're looking at it. And that being that, what I find is there is obviously a great deal of confidence that guys, let's just again, like those two guys or yourself have, like they know what they know, and they're very confident in that, and they're ready and willing to apply it whenever they need to, and they're not afraid to say that or talk about it, which again, for some people would be like, this seems a little egotistical, or it seems a little bit overconfident or cocky or whatever else. But for me, when I started singing, this was what kind of drew me to it in a funky way, which was it's matched with a certain level of humility. And that humility is like, I understand that there's a lot of things that people are going to question me on that I really don't have a really great answer for them for. Not because I don't have an answer for it, but because the answer that I try to provide for them, they don't have a deep enough knowledge to be able to receive the answer I give them and be able to put the pieces together. You just mentioned it, like the skill of coaching or talking through somebody that hasn't spent any time around this or wants to go to the 40-hour course and be the end all be all to combatives training, at the end of the thing. So I guess what I'm saying, I say all that to say is there's a level of confidence that's also matched with the level of humility, which I think is, it offsets people's bullshit meter maybe in their own head. Like, I don't get this. This guy's saying stuff, but it also feels weird. I don't get it. What can you say about that? I mean, am I making sense? Because that's
Yeah.
the way I look at it.
So it's funny. I pulled an exercise on one of my female coworkers, right, where I did some BS wrist lock, and I'm like, yeah, like as a 120-pound woman, you'll be able to control a 200-pound man with this. And she like, oh, okay, like she was trying to be like, look, even there, you knew what I was saying. You're not a fighter, but you know what I'm saying is BS.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what happens. Like even people who are total laymen may not, they're totally outside of this very niche and novel
Mm-hmm.
form of training. They know BS when they hear it. They know the truth when they hear it as well. And I think that's what is going on with like kind of the circle of guys that I run with, is that they're not talking about it because like that's what they want you to believe. It's like, hey, look, this is what I've seen. This is what I experienced. This is what you'll experience. And what's also powerful about their explanation as far as like the dynamics of fighting is that people get to experience it themselves. So it's supported by, like, I'm not teaching people engagement strategy. Like there's not like one fight to define them all.
Right.
Every single fight's unique because it's unique to the individuals. You got the attributes that you got. The environment is changing.
Time and terrain, all that
Right.
stuff.
So
Yep.
it's like there's no one op to define them all, but we can extract core skill sets that happen as far
Mhm.
as like what things work and what doesn't. And then when people get to try those things out for themselves, they it's like, you don't have to believe me, believe your own experience. And those people are the ones that are actually corroborating as far as what the instructors are saying, as far as like the circles I run in. That's what's going on, I think. And I think people, even their limited experience with violence, they're like, you know, I can hear what he's saying. Like, there's nothing that isn't on YouTube as far as knife attacks, fist fights, or anything. So I think people, they know the truth when they see it. And, the one thing that MMA has done is that it's really made it hard for people to maintain mysticism. What we've seen really is that all the same permeating myths, overcomplication, uh, sciency language that you see in fitness, firearms, and fighting, it's all the same. It does not have to be as complicated as it is.
Right.
But the people that generally do that, it sets off people's BS meter. And I think that's really what's going on, is that as far as training goes, which any given arena, we're really in the age of truth as far as training goes, because it's like there's too much information out there where people can ignore it. I mean, and if people want to do something, like if they want to do lightsaber fighting or whatever it is that they're doing, cool, but like don't say like you're prepared for a real fight. Like you're like the Death Star isn't going to descend and the Sith coming out. Like you're like, that's not what's going on, right? Like you're doing something you like to do, and that's great. I'm happy, but like we are using those skills. We're not doing those skills.
I love that. You mentioned that before, and that is going to stick with me. That's going to be a huge takeaway from that in terms of using the martial arts versus doing the martial arts. And more importantly, I think what you said was marrying yourself to an identity that exists within that. However, you've chosen to, again, I do martial arts. Going back to the mixed martial arts piece, I think part of the challenge here too is right now, like UFC is an example. I mean, you can't, there's not a place on the planet that you could go and say UFC and people would know what you're talking about. I mean, the brand there is massive, right? And they know what that is to some extent. My mother, 75-year-old mother, she knows exactly what that is. And she doesn't understand it. She hates it, but she knows exactly what it is. She knows it's two dudes or, whatever now, get into an octagon, and they're very, very, very little protective clothing or clothing at all. And they beat the shit out of one another until somebody breaks an arm, gets knocked out, or gives up, kind of thing. It's different than boxing, which she's obviously very familiar with, which is more normalized and popularized, right? So, but now UFC is that popular. And it isn't what we're talking about in the larger scheme of combatives. So people still haven't made the connection between what they see on TV and the sport of MMA, or even what they see on TV or at the BJJ school in terms of the sport of BJJ, which is very different than what we're talking about. We're talking about this next level world of using martial arts in the combatives world when we're talking about what you said, which was, but what happens if I get into a fight and there's a gun involved somewhere, whether I have it on me and he doesn't know, or he has one on him and I don't know about it yet, or whatever else? Everything you see on TV, while there may be some things that may trickle over into this is not the same. And so I think people have a tough time drawing that reality, or the line, connecting the dots with reality there. And the second, I think the last part of this is like, if you wanted to explore this world, it's going to look and feel much different than, again, martial arts or boxing. So you're going to have to get your head completely away from that and understand that what you're committing yourself to is nothing like what you've been committed to as, whatever it took you to be a BJJ blue belt. There's some similarity, right? You're going to be forehead to forehead. You're going to be, hand to hand. It's very intimate and those things, but it is still very different in the way that these things are applied. And I guess what I've taken away from this is while there are a lot of places out there doing this, there's a lot of them. Some of them, obviously, there's a market for this. So there's some places that are doing it better than others. It hasn't really evolved yet to where it's the mainstream will see this as normal or even understand it. They're probably the closest thing, people kind of understand maybe is Krav Maga. I don't want to even go down that road. I don't want to get into that. But my point being, it's not popularized in a way where people can look at it and be accepting of it. And in order to train this, and you were articulating all of this, like, you got to make a real commitment to it. And it takes a lot of time to understand how to, quote unquote, use the martial art instead of do the martial arts to get through it. I feel like I'm kind of rambling now, but this again is part of my journey in trying to understand and be able to articulate in my own head what I'm seeing, what I kind of see culturally, and who the players are that are actually impacting this. And I think in maybe more of a productive way than a less productive way.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why I like to bring up my friend Jay is, like, he's one of the few people out there who has every credential as far as, like, action guy that you could want in an instructor. And he's like, yeah, you know what? I haven't really, like, he had, like, very few people have the humility like that, where it's like, yeah, you know what? That's not really my lane. I'm not gonna venture down that road. But there are a lot of guys, like action guys, that they went through a course while they worked at a place,
Mhm.
and they're putting out content.
Based on
Um,
that, based on their
yeah,
experience there. Yeah.
correct. And I think it's well intentioned, but I think also misguided.
I think that's
Because
exactly the way I would put it. Yes.
yeah, but because it's a very different thing when you are on the offensive, right? Pretty much, if, like, you initiate most of what, especially with a weapon, um, most of that is going to be somewhat effective. At least you're most of the way there. But the difference for us stateside, and especially as I'm, regardless of how long I serve, I'm going to spend most of my time as a civilian. Okay,
Mhm.
because I got to get off work at some point, and I'm going to retire at some point. So, with that in mind, most of the general population, their situation in terms of principle is going to be defensive in nature. And what that looks like is, day chooses you. Okay. Um, and the way Craig puts it is a reactionary deficit and disproportionate armament. So the way that looks like is, you're approached, okay? The bad guy decides, right? You're selected by somebody. You don't know you're selected. And even then, right? Like, how do I know the person I'm talking to? How do I distinguish between someone with hostile intent versus someone with violent intent, or someone just being aggressive, right? Like an aggressive panhandler, right? Just cursing at you because you don't want to give them $1, versus someone who really wants to stick me up, or wanting to stab me or something like that.
You're talking about like an asocial predator versus just
Correct.
somebody who's having a bad day, right?
Correct. Like there's a large disparity between those things, right? And even what I say and how I interact in that circumstance, I could put somebody on either side of that based on what I say, right? And who knows, right? I mean, the Dink Heller incident where that deputy, Georgia State deputy, was shot by a guy he pulled over. He was just that guy he pulled over. He was only upset because he was like, I'm not going to have a young man talk to me that way.
Right. I remember this. Yep.
Right? So it's like we don't know the type of things that'll put somebody over the edge, what's like disrespectful for them or anything like that. And again, right, this is kind of the deficit people have, right? And most of the time it's like nobody's really going to choose a Scott Howell to pick on, right? Like nobody's
It's
like,
true.
this guy with this big beard who's obviously fit.
It's true.
Yeah, that's not the type of target. So like the type of people who need this type of training, like they're kind of they're uninitiated on all this stuff. So again, I think there's a lot of good intentions out there, but as far as like what the actual problem is, what the real circumstances most people face, I think a lot of people, if they use their institutional training, it's going to be exactly the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, I think that is a larger component of this that bothers me a bit, in that we're giving people, and this happens in the fitness industry, it happens in the firearms instructional space and whatever, that we're giving people a sense of false confidence, or it's just not reality in a lot of ways. People are walking away with ideas in their head that are not well founded or developed, and certainly not practiced. And so obviously, if you're giving somebody a checklist of items, this is what you do in this system to defeat this particular problem or this particular adversary, you're already losing, and you should be running far and fast. And I think what you just brought up there is an important piece to realize as people are looking, again, like the outside eyes looking in and hearing and seeing things and trying to process what they're hearing and seeing, as well as like making a call it a judgment call, or some type of an assessment on the person they hear actually saying it. That being like, I don't really understand, this is bullshit, or whatever else. But it's also like a lot of time you're seeing a lot of action. I actually think Craig, because he's come up so many times, doing a really good job actually showing more of what his classes do include. And I've talked to a lot of people who've gone through them. Like, it's not all throw on the helmets, and the gloves and go at it. There's a lot of situational awareness. There's a lot of de-escalation, practice, theory, things that go into it, where you're getting to role play a lot of this stuff. You're getting to see it, and then obviously, at some point you're going to go hands on. It's going to get real, to the extent that it can get real in a class like that. But this being part of this end of it, and the guys that are teaching it, again, the circle that you're talking about, they're discussing this. It just might not be as public, in the public eye. But there's also a point where, like, now we're not discussing this anymore. We are talking about, we're beyond this. Now what happens when violence is the answer? Because there isn't another one. There's not another choice. And that tick over, that threshold, I guess maybe is the way to put it, I think is really a really tough thing for people to navigate, as like, well, what does that actually mean? Because if you, as they say, if you've never actually been punched in the face in your life, then you don't know until it happens, and it's a shock. Like, it's smarts, and it's going to catch your attention real quick. Now, what are you going to do? I don't know. Again, at risk of rambling on, I think those pieces of being able to break down the, like, what situation am I actually looking at here with this person that's confronted me, and what what are my options? Not what is the answer, but what are my options here? One is let's just get the fuck out of there, right? If you can, right? And maybe that's not the answer, right? Maybe that person gets a vote, you know, that asshole gets a vote, or he gets to make a decision, and getting out of there might not be feasible. So
I think what you're saying, what you're describing is something I like to kind of simplify for people is like, hey, look, the verbal judo is not going to work without real judo. Like if you are talking a big game, but you can't deliver, like it doesn't matter. Like,
right.
look, because ultimately, as far as de-escalation, how that, right, as far as bringing things down to where it doesn't escalate to violence, that's an agreement. And if the other person has to agree, and if they don't agree, you got to be able to do something about that. And I think there's a like, again, like that's another thing that's well intentioned, but it's like, hey, you know, you need to de-escalate. How and what happens when it doesn't work, right? And like what exactly does that mean, right? Like it. So again, right? Like there's a lot of like catch-all blanket statements, and it's like I think people are starting to see where the Venn diagram is like combatives is one of those points where it's like, oh, okay, this thing is its own thing,
Yes.
but it also intersects with everything else. It's also
Yes.
kind of the link between everything. It's
Mhm.
like that de-escalation, and then the other side of when they don't agree. That's the use of force as but also while maintaining that ability to escalate and de-escalate as needed. You know what I mean? Like all these components, as far as like the dynamics of a fight and providing a real experience that somebody who is not part of who's not a adherent martial artist can walk away with understanding a general strategy as far as like how to avoid a fight and as well as how to win a fight. What does it look like? What does vulnerable look like? And how do I get to a point of dominance or at least a position of advantage? Right. And that's really like, you know, it's taken, oh my, for me, almost 20 years
I
to
was just gonna
figure
say
that out.
step one took 20
Right.
years. Yeah.
So like, yeah. And, you know, so where one of the things I've been working with Nick Delgadillo from Starting Strength is putting together kind of a linear progression in terms of like, how do I get somebody with zero fighting skills, zero shooting skills, and at least have them functional from a pistol, understanding articulation, appropriate use of force, and as far as like what does winning look like, right? And
Man,
for us, in
that's a
terms
tall
of
order to fill. That is a tall order
right,
to fill, my man. Yeah.
right, and I think we're close. I have a diagram, and I think we're fairly close. Been working with him and Craig Douglas on it. But that's my goal. There is I really have three big goals that I want to do. Is number one is like I want to bridge the gaps, right? Um, like for a long time, people are like, oh yeah, strength doesn't matter in jujitsu. Yeah, it actually does. Right?
I can
People
tell
are
you from
saying
firsthand experience it does, because that's how I survived on the mat most of the time.
right, and it's so funny because people are like, oh, you see how tired that is. It's because the technique conquers all. Like, well, you know what? Everybody's tired their first day. Everybody who's never done this before, they're not as good as the people who've been doing this a lot.
Sure.
But then when that guy gets a blue belt, he's a monster.
Mhm.
He's a monster, right? And so strength matters. So that's why I like working with starting strength, bridging the gap there, and also providing a platform or a co-location, right, where people can actually train with all these guys and meet people that they may not have heard of. Uh, because like you understand, Scott, like travel to go and get professional development, it's time intensive. It's a huge commitment fiscally and physically.
Mhm.
And so how do we do that? So that's kind of where the combatives came from. The Combative Summit came from is really fulfilling that component. Is like how do we provide people as much information, as much value possible in the shortest time available to us, and like so that's like my big goals within the industry.